Nothing special. Just 60 years later, the Soviet T-34 went out for a showdown in Budapest again. How it happened and how the unexpected hijacking ended. Have you ever seen a ghost come to life? Not the kind that scares people in old castles at night, but a ghost of history. A ghost made of steel, fire, and blood. A ghost that seemed to have forever frozen in bronze and memory as a warning. I hadn't, until that very day, watching that very video, which gave me goosebumps, and I'll attach it a bit later to build up suspense. I experienced a wild mix of emotions. It was a delight that felt like sacrilege, terror bordering on admiration, and most importantly, a complete, absolute lack of understanding. How? How is this even possible in the 21st century, in the center of a European capital, under the flash of cameras and the whistle of bullets? Imagine this picture. Budapest, autumn. Not the touristy, rainbow-colored city with gingerbread houses and the smell of goulash, but a city tense as a string. A city that smells of smoke, sweat, and rage. And against this gray, tense reality, something appears from another time. A long gun barrel, armor contours familiar to the point of pain, tracks that once ground down not only soil, but also the fates of entire nations. This is a T-34-85, a legend, a symbol, a weapon of death and liberation at the same time. And it's not on a pedestal. It started its diesel engine, clanked its tracks, and moved. It moved just like 60 years ago to war. I felt like laughing from the absurdity and crying from the horror. But most of all, I wanted to get to the truth. How did it happen? How did this iron legend, which was supposed to quietly rust in a museum, end up at the forefront of a modern political confrontation? Who were those people who dared to take the controls of history? And most importantly, how did this insane, desperate ride end? This hijacking of the century, which is even hard to call a hijacking. It was something akin to resurrecting a dinosaur. If you think this is a simple story about hooligans and a tank, you are deeply mistaken. This is a matryoshka doll of a story. This is a tale about memory that does not die, about technology that outlives its creators, about politics that uses symbols as a battering ram, and about ordinary people caught inside this steel hurricane. Get comfortable, because we will analyze this story from the very foundation. We will go deeper than anything you've read before. We will talk about the tank itself, about Hungary, about its complex relationship with the past, and I will share my opinion on why this story is not just a curiosity, but a powerful symptom of our times. But first, let's dispel the main, most tenacious myth. A myth that migrates from blog to blog, and which, frankly, is infuriating in its absurdity. Myth number one, they took it off a pedestal. Sound familiar? I've heard this version 100 times myself. Like the protesters, all so skilled and desperate, rolled up to a monument, climbed onto a high pedestal, somehow started the heart of the legend, which is 60 years old, and then just as deftly drove down to the ground, like Dom Toretto in his souped-up car. Let's be realistic, friends. I really want you to imagine, right now, any monument to the T-34 in your or a neighboring city. Write in the comments what it looks like. In my city, there are 2 of them, and both are on huge, meter-high, or even taller, concrete pedestals. They are monuments. They are meant to be contemplated, not used for their intended purpose. Now let's use logic. First, to start a tank, you don't need an ignition key that can be picked like a safe lock. It's a complex process requiring knowledge and preparation. But okay, let's say there was their own Kudryashk from Podobny who knows his way around tanks. Second, fuel. Have you ever put gas in a car that's been sitting in a garage for a year? And here, 60 years. The oil in the engine has turned to stone. The hoses have decayed. The fuel system is coked up. It wouldn't even start, let alone run. The pistons are probably seized to the cylinder block solid. That's the first thing. Third, and most obvious, how do you, drive it off that very pedestal? It's not a curbstone. It's a height of a man's stature. Try driving off such a height, even on a tractor. You'll either flip over or damage the undercarriage so badly you won't move a meter. A tank is not a toy. It has its limits too. So, dear lovers of thrilling theories, The version with the pedestal is a beautiful but absolute fairy tale. It doesn't hold up to any criticism. It's like saying that protesters in Moscow started a mammoth from the Paleontological Museum and rode it to the Kremlin. Sounds epic, but unreal. So where did this tank come from then? Here we come to the first layer of our matryoshka, the truth. The truth stranger than fiction, a museum exhibit on the city streets. Digging through sources, and I studied dozens of articles, reports, and summaries, including authoritative publications like VZ, I came across a quote that sets everything straight. I quote verbatim. In the afternoon, the opposition intensified pressure on police cordons. A group of young people managed to start a museum T-34 tank, which was standing on one of the central streets, and direct it towards the police cordons. The tank was exhibited at an outdoor exhibition dedicated to the events of 1956. The demonstrators set the vehicle in motion. There it is. The whole point, in one phrase, the tank was exhibited at an outdoor exhibition. This was not a tank on an eternal pedestal. It was a museum exhibit, placed on public display as part of a temporary exposition dedicated to the events of 1956. And now, friends, let's take a pause. Because without understanding what 1956 means for Hungary, this story is just an anecdote about drunk students and a tank. But in reality, this is the key to everything that happened. And here we will dive into history, without which everything else is just white noise. The shadow of 1956. Why this tank is not just iron. The 34 that drove towards the police in 2016 was displayed as a reminder of the Hungarian uprising of 1956. For those who don't know what that was, let me explain in simple terms. It was one of the most tragic and bloody pages of the Cold War. Hungary, one of the countries of the Eastern Bloc, wanted more freedom, democracy, independence from Moscow. Peaceful protests began, which quickly turned into an armed uprising. And the Soviet leadership under Khrushchev decided to resolve the issue with a forceful method. Soviet troops were sent into Budapest. And yes, those very T-34 tanks, the same ones that liberated Budapest from the fascists in '45, were now crushing the Hungarian counter-revolution. Imagine this horror. The same streets, the same tanks, the same clanking of tracks. Only now they are shooting not at the enemy, but at those who want freedom. It was a terrible, cynical, and cruel lesson. Thousands died, a crushed hope. And so, 60 years later, the authorities decide to place a tank, a symbol of that tragedy, on one of the central streets of Budapest as part of a memorial exhibition. From a museum perspective, it's a strong move. From a political perspective, it's playing with fire. It's like placing a guillotine on the square in France on Bastille Day. It wakes demons. And these demons woke up. The tank stood there not as a soulless piece of metal. It stood as a ghost, as the embodiment of state violence, as an open wound of the nation. And when the streets filled with anger and protest again, this ghost could not remain on the sidelines. Someone among the protesters saw the irony of fate in this. Like, you're putting up a monument to our defeat? We'll show you now that memory, it's alive. That this symbol of your power can become a symbol of our anger. And so a group of young people, whose names we will probably never know, approaches the tank. They weren't military, but apparently, among them was someone who understood old technology. Maybe a historical reenactor, maybe a village guy who's on good terms with tractors. They climbed inside, and a miracle happened. No, not a mystical one, a technical one. The T-34 phenomenon. Why does the 34 live forever? And now, friends, let's digress for a minute and talk about the main hero of this whole affair, the T-34 tank itself. Why could it even be started? It's not a Ziguli, where you can change the spark plugs and go. The answer lies in the brilliant, I would even say barbarically simple, design of this machine. The T-34 was created in the terrible years of the war with one condition. It had to be as simple as a hammer, and just as reliable. It had to be assembled by a half-starved teenager at Europlant. It had to be repaired in field conditions by a frozen, tired soldier with almost bare hands. The V234 engine, a 500 horsepower diesel beast. It could run on the lowest quality diesel, on kerosene, even on rapeseed oil. The ignition system? Maximum primitive. Electronics? What electronics? Everything is mechanical, on cables, on levers. Imagine you sit in this tank. Around you, not buttons and displays, but iron levers, pedals, and a huge crank handle for starting. Yes, many T-34s were started manually, with the help of this very handle, like an old Belarus tractor. It's hellish physical labor, but it's possible. And so, these guys, in the heat of adrenaline, managed to turn this ancient mechanism. They found fuel in the tanks, and in a museum piece that might even have been used in parades sometimes if WWII could have been there. They connected the batteries, and at some point, the heart of the steel veteran, lying in a coma for decades, ignited. The diesel roared to life, black, choking, but so desired smoke poured from the exhaust pipe. What did it feel like? What was it like to sit inside this iron box, smelling of fuel oil, dust, and history, and hear the legend come to life beneath you? I think at that moment, they didn't fully understand what they were doing. It was a moment of pure, primal ecstasy. A human being subjugated a time machine. They were not hooligans. They were demigods who brought a monument to life. And then the euphoria ended. Reality began. And the reality is this. You have 40 tons of lethal force in your hands. And ahead, police cordons. Economic background. Why was Budapest boiling? The context of the 2000s. To understand the fury of the protests, you can't just look at politics. You have to look at the economy. After all, a hungry person angers more strongly, and a person who feels injustice angers even more strongly. Let me explain in simple terms what was happening in Hungary on the eve of those events. In 2016, Hungary was a country with great ambitions, but also big problems. After the collapse of the Eastern Bloc, it rushed into the embrace of the European Union and capitalism. At first, there was growth, optimism, but then the global financial crisis of 2008 hit, and it hit Hungary very hard. The situation for the people, public debt, it was huge. Imagine your family owes banks an amount several times your annual income. That's how it was for the state. Money was borrowed, mostly in foreign currency, euros, Swiss francs, and when their exchange rate jumped, people had nothing to pay their apartment loans with. Unemployment, especially in the provinces. Young people couldn't find work. People were leaving for England and Germany to wash dishes, just to feed their families. Corruption. Rumors spread that the authorities and their oligarch friends were embezzling EU money. Ordinary people saw how some were getting rich before their eyes, while others were barely making ends meet. Social tension. The government carried out unpopular reforms, cut social benefits, and raised taxes. The people felt cheated, that the promised European life turned out to be a mirage. Against this background, any spark could start a fire. This spark was an amendment to the law on higher education, which, in the opinion of the opposition, limited academic freedoms and was directed against the Central European University. For students and the intelligentsia, this was the last straw. But they were quickly joined by all the dissatisfied, those who lost their jobs, those who couldn't pay off their loans, those who were furious about corruption. So the protest, which the tank drove into, was not just a student action. It was an explosion of popular anger that had been accumulating for years. And the tank became its most powerful, most shocking symbol. Not because they wanted to kill anyone, but because they wanted to be heard. They shouted as loud as they could, with the steel voice of history. 30 seconds of chaos, what that very video showed. And now we approach the climax. The tank started. It slowly, majestically, like a dreadnought, begins to move along the Budapest pavement. The tracks tear up the asphalt, leaving black scars behind. The sound of its engine drowns out the cries of the crowd, the sirens, everything. Imagine yourself in the place of a police officer. You're standing with a shield, a helmet, you have a baton, maybe tear gas. You expect stones, bottles, maybe Molotov cocktails. But you do not expect a tank to be slowly, inexorably advancing on you. Even if you know it's a museum piece. Even if you understand it probably has no ammunition. Instincts, embedded at the genetic level, scream one thing: run. That very video, I promise, shows exactly that. Panic. Unspeakable animal panic. The police cordons begin to scatter. The crowd rejoices. This is the moment of the triumph of madness over order. These are 30 seconds when history broke loose and went on a rampage. The footage looks like a Hollywood blockbuster. A gray, mighty tank, bristling with a gun barrel, crushes plastic barriers, and people in uniforms scatter from it like cockroaches. It's terrifying and mesmerizing at the same time. In these seconds, it seems that anything is possible. That now this steel ghost will drive through the whole city and something in this country will change forever. But friends, life, unlike movies, rarely has happy endings. Or at least, simple ones. The denouement, when the law arrives on armor. The euphoria did not last long. The police came to their senses. The shock passed and was replaced by cold, calculating rage. Imagine, you're the chief of police of Budapest. In front of your eyes, your subordinates were humiliated, state power was mocked, and with the use of a symbol of national tragedy. The response must be lightning fast and harsh. And it followed. Everything happened very quickly. The tank, clumsy and slow, did not manage to go far. It was surrounded. Special forces vehicles arrived, and the assault began. A real one, not a movie one. Imagine you are inside this iron can. First, you hear dull blows on the armor. These are stun grenades and tear gas canisters flying. Through the cracks and hatches, acrid smoke begins to seep inside. You can't breathe. Your eyes are watering. You are disoriented. Then, sharp pops on the armor. These are not tracers. As some think, these are most likely warning shots from automatic weapons. The sound inside the tank is deafening. It's like sitting inside a giant drum set being hit with a sledgehammer. And then, a grinding sound. An attempt to pry open the hatches. Shouts from outside. Get out. Surrender. What would you feel? Perida? No. The madness of what is happening reaches you through the smoke and roar. You understand that the game is over. That you're not at war. You're in the center of a European city. And you are a hijacker, a terrorist in the eyes of the authorities. Further, only death. And they surrendered. One by one, streaming tears from the gas. Choking, they crawled out of the steel belly of their steed and were immediately pinned down. The story, lasting several dozen minutes, was over. The tank ghost was pacified, but its short appearance on the stage of history left a scar on the city's memory. My opinion, why this story is not about hijacking but about us. Friends, here we are at the most important part. What I think about all this. For me, this story is not about vandalism and not about heroism. It is a huge, multi-layered mirror reflecting all our problems. First, this is a story about how we deal with history. Placing a tank, a symbol of the suppression of freedom, on a street where passions are boiling is like playing with a grenade. The authorities wanted to remind people of the power of the state, but got an answer. Symbols are a double-edged weapon. The people can take them away from you. Second, this is a story about powerlessness. Those guys in the tank, they are not revolutionaries. They are the desperate. They didn't have a political program. They only had a loud, steel megaphone into which they shouted, "We are here. We exist. And we are furious." Their action was desperate, stupid, dangerous, but at its core lay a feeling of total frustration, familiar today to millions of people around the world. Third, this is a story about the power of technology. The T-34 outlived the empire that created it. It outlived its creators, its crews, its wars. It became an artifact, an icon. And that day it proved that it is more than iron. It is an idea that can be used in different ways. It is a terrible and great power. Next time you pass by some monument, a war memorial, stop for a minute. Look at it not as a stone or iron idol. Look at it as a sleeping demon, a demon of memory. And think, what words, what actions can wake it up? And are we ready for what it will say to us in response? This story ended predictably with the defeat of the hijackers. But its main outcome, in my opinion, is different. It showed that the past never leaves. It sleeps, and sometimes, to remind us of itself, it only needs to start the engine.